Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video that I'm doing here is the sixth in a series of 6 videos about covenant theology, which is a part of my playlist, which is aimed at explaining new covenant theology. The playlist you can see right here. When I finish it, I will have videos on three theological systems which try to explain the relationship between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Covenant theology, dispensationalism, and New Covenant theology. I'm finishing up covenant theology in this video, and the next video I'll start on dispensationalism. This video is going to aim at explaining how the church is now spiritual Israel. I hope you enjoy it. All right, in my previous 5 videos on covenant theology, I explained how the covenant theologians have 3 main covenants: the covenants of works, covenants of redemption, covenants of works, covenant of grace. I gave a historical overview, showed how that it ended up in the Westminster Confession, and now most Presbyterians hold to this. Talked about 3 divisions of the law: the civil, the ceremonial, and the moral. And the way covenant theologians like to say, we're free from the civil and the ceremonial law, but we're not free from the moral law of Moses. It passes through from Moses to the New Covenant. And of course, New Covenant theology disagrees with that and says that the law is a unit and that the entire Old Testament law of Moses was abrogated and replaced by the law of Christ. Then I talked about the reformers, the foolish reformers who have begun with the Spirit and they have ended up with works of the law instead of faith for sanctification. Is to maybe put too strong a point on it, but the reformers love to use the law of Moses for sanctification. They say Moses drives us to Jesus to get us saved, and Jesus drives us back to Moses to get us sanctified. And how I said I don't agree with that. That New Covenant theology does not agree with that. Now we're going to look at how the church is spiritual Israel, and here covenant theology agrees with New Covenant theology. The church is a fulfillment of the types of Israel. So the church is spiritual Israel. In other words, a fulfillment of the types of the Old Testament. So let's get started with part number 5 on my PowerPoints, the church is spiritual Israel. And I'm going to divide this topic into 5 subpoints. I already have gone over the first 3 of the subpoints. After an introduction, I pointed out scripturally how the old Israel becomes the church, the new Israel. I gave you a lot of scriptures on that. Then I talked about how the old lawgiver Moses became the new lawgiver Jesus. And I mentioned that even though New Covenant theology has a stronger view of that, they say that not only was the lawgiver new, but the law itself was new. But covenant theologians say that the lawgiver is new, but the law is the same, and the new lawgiver Jesus just straightened up the Pharisaic perversions of the Old Testament law. And then today, in this video, I'm going to talk about how the promises to Abraham are fulfilled in the church. I'm going to spend most of my time here, and then I'm going to finish up with some, if I have time, on how Old Jerusalem becomes the New Jerusalem. So let's look at how the promises to Abraham are fulfilled in the church. And this is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to conflict between non-dispensational theologies and dispensational theologies. First of all, I'm going to divide this subpart into 5 subparts, if you will. I'm going to first of all talk about God's 3 promises to Abraham and show you where they are in Genesis, and then I'm going to talk about how those 3 promises are fulfilled. The 3 promises are the land promises. Part 2 I'll talk about. Part 3, the fulfillment of the offspring promises. And part 4, the fulfillment of the blessing promises. The way I remember the blessings to Abraham is LOB, land, offspring, and blessing. Lob, like somebody's lobbing a tennis ball trying to get his opponent off the net. As I talk about these, the fulfillment of these promises, land, offspring, and blessing promises, I am going to show how they are physically fulfilled in physical Jews and how they're spiritually fulfilled in Christian Jews, children of Abraham who are spiritual children of Abraham. And then I'm going to finish off by a special consideration of Joshua 21:43 through 45, which really just hammers home the point that the land promise has already been fulfilled, which is opposed to the dispensationalist idea is that these promises will not be fulfilled until a future millennium, thus leaving a gap. I'm going to show that no, the land promises have already been fulfilled physically, and they've been spiritually fulfilled in the church, so it's foolish to think that these promises are going to be fulfilled way off into the future in some imaginary millennium. Or if you believe in that millennium, okay, that's fine. But the promises aren't going to be fulfilled there. They're going to be fulfilled in the church. Now, that Joshua 21:43 through 45 hammers that home, but I broke it out just to save some space up here when I talk about the fulfillment of the land promises. All right, so let's get started. God's three promises to Abraham. First of all, God promised Abraham land, Genesis 13, chapter 13, verses 14 through 15. After Lot had separated from Abraham, the Lord said to Abram, this is Abraham before he got his name changed, look from the place where you are, look north and south, east and west. And by the way, he was standing south of Jerusalem, right at the head of the Dead Sea, and up there on that mountain there, I've been there, and you can just look for as far as the eye can see. You can just see forever. For I will give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. So there's the promise. You and your offspring, and the old King James says seed. I'm going to use offspring. You and your offspring forever all the land that you see. Now, of course, the dispensationalists love to say that this offspring are the Jews, and the land is the physical land of Israel. They're going to have the land of Israel forever, and that state over there in Israel is part of this promise, and there's going to be Israel in the end of the world and all that eschatological stuff. No. We're going to show that it's fulfilled in the church, not in... Well, it's going to be fulfilled in the land, but it's already fulfilled in the land, which is a type of its fulfillment in the church, in spiritual Israel. All right, there's the land promise. Here's the offspring promise. Genesis 12, verses 2, first part of the verse. Verse 2, first part of the verse. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. That word nation does not mean a political nation like France or Spain. It's talking about people group. You're going to be a great tribe. A bunch of Jews are going to come, physical Jews are going to come from your loins, Abraham. Again, in Genesis 12, verse 7, first part of the verse, but the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your offspring. So there's the land promise hooked up with the offspring promise. They go together. Then in Genesis 13:16, we have this. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. This is a good example of Hebrew hyperbole. You can't count the dust of the earth, and that's how many Jews they're going to be. Physical Jews, your offspring. Later to be fulfilled with spiritual Jews. Okay? Still looking at God's promise to give Abraham an offspring. He says in Genesis 15:5, he took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, your offspring will be that. And you notice that the offspring will be like sand and stars, easy to remember. Sand and stars, like the dust of the earth, sand by the seashore, which I'll show you in this verse, Genesis 22:17. I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. There's stars and sand. Your offspring will possess the gate of their enemies. They will be so powerful and so many. Now the third blessing is, the third promise is that Abraham's seed will be a blessing to the nations. Let's read that in, let me back up here a minute. I went too far. We can see this promise in Genesis 12, verse 2, second part of the verse, to verse 3. God says to Abraham, I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. All the families of the earth be blessed. We'll show you how that will be fulfilled both physically and spiritually. All right, so those are God's three promises to Abraham listed out for you, and now we're going to look at the fulfillment of each of them physically and spiritually. Let's start with subpart 2 here, the fulfillment of the land promise. Starting out with the physical fulfillment of the land promise, Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And that, in red, that should be the end of dispensationalism right there, in my humble opinion. The Lord gave Israel all the land. What land? The land which he had sworn, which he had promised to give them. The promised land, just like in that promise I just gave you. What, the sand and the stars. Excuse me, that was the offspring. In Genesis 13, the land promise, where Abraham looked over all the land there, north of the Dead Sea, and God said, I'm going to give it all to you. And so the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to Abraham his fathers, and they possessed it, and they lived in it. There's the fulfillment. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, Joshua continues, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Well, if all the promises came to pass, and none of them failed, and one of the promises was to Abraham that he would have land, his descendants would have land, well, guess what? They had land. Joshua fulfills it right here. This is one of my favorite anti-dispensational verses. Now, what the dispensationalists will do, they say, yeah, well, true, Abraham got the land, his descendants got the land, but there's going to be a double fulfillment in the future when physical Israel gets it. Well, and you want to say to that, well, maybe there's a triple fulfillment, maybe there's a quadruple fulfillment. You want to start speculate about the future all you want. Might as well speculate about maybe the state of the economy or the stock market. You speculate about the future. See how right you are. It's already been fulfilled, folks. That's Joshua 21. Now let's move on, continuing with the physical fulfillment of the land promise. Another one of my favorite verses, 1 Kings 4:21. Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt, and they brought tribute and served Solomon. It actually doesn't say the Euphrates River. It says the river, which everybody takes to be the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River bends over to the northwest as it runs up from the Persian Gulf, and it ends up going through Syria. And so Solomon ruled all the way up there in Syria and all the way down to the border of Egypt, which most people say is the Wadi El Arish, the southern. It's a little river that comes out of the Mediterranean Sea south of the present-day Gaza. Separating Egypt from Israel. So Solomon ruled it all. Solomon was about 10th century BC, in the 900s BC. So Abraham's promise, Abraham was about 1950 or so BC. So we're talking about, 1,000 years later, promise is fulfilled. Solomon's father David defeated Hadadezer, the king of Syria, as he went to restore his rule at the river Euphrates. So even David ruled all the way up to the Euphrates River. Now, I think the way the dispensationalists try to fudge this, if I remember correctly, they say, well, now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms. That means that there were some tributary kingdoms in between. Who were those people? I can't remember the names of those people up there in the north and between the Lebanon mountain ranges. And so Israel really didn't get the land. It wasn't really fulfilled. Nonsense. If you're ruling over a people and they're paying you tribute, that's yours. Like the Assyrians, when they got tribute from their cities, it was Assyria. All right, so the land has been physically fulfilled already. It has been shown to be physically fulfilled already in those two verses. Now let's look at Deuteronomy 19:7-9. This is kind of an interesting argument. This is where the cities of refuge are set up. These were cities where people who accidentally killed somebody, manslayers, they could run to those cities so that the kin of the deceased could not go after them and kill them in blood revenge. This was so that the law courts could Israeli law courts could take care of the situation and not private revenge. So Moses says this, therefore I command you, God says to the people of Israel through Moses, therefore I command you, saying, you shall set aside 3 cities for yourself, 3 cities of refuge, if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, just as he has sworn to your fathers. There's the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham. If this promise is fulfilled, if God enlarges your territory just as he has promised, and he gives you all the land which he has promised to give to your fathers, if he does that, then you shall add 3 more cities for yourself beside these 3. Well, we know from reading Joshua 20, verses 7 through 9, that the 3 extra cities were indeed set up. So all 6 cities were set up. Well, the 6 cities were to be set up and established on a condition. What was the condition? If the Lord gave you all the land that was promised. The promised land. The land which was promised. Were the 6 cities set up? Yes. So therefore, the preceding condition must have happened. The land was enlarged that God had promised to the fathers, and therefore the 6 cities were set up. Slam dunk, folks. The land promise was already fulfilled physically. Now, let's go through some more scriptures just to drive the point home, even drive the nail in the coffin even deeper for the dispensationalists. 2 Chronicles 9:26. And he, referring to Solomon, was the ruler over all the kings from the Euphrates River even to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt, the Wadi el-Arish. Some people say it's the Nile River, but that doesn't matter. Then Solomon's land would be even bigger. I don't believe it's the Nile River. I believe it's the Wadi el-Arish. Now, so there we have confirmation that Solomon ruled all the way from Euphrates down to Egypt. Now we can look at Nehemiah 9:8. And thou didst make a covenant with him to give him, Abraham, the land of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite, and the Girgashite, to give it to his descendants. There's the promise to Abraham and his seed, to his offspring, give it to his descendants, and thou hast fulfilled thy promise. There it is in red. The land promise has been fulfilled. The land, right here, which promised, and thou hast fulfilled thy promise. That's in Nehemiah 9:8. Now let's go to Jeremiah 11:5. As soon as I learn how to control my PowerPoints here. Jeremiah 11:5. In order to confirm the oath, that's where people swear, they make a promise. In order to confirm the oath which I swore to your forefathers to give them a land flowing with milk and honey, as it is to this day. And this is Jeremiah talking. He was writing in about, the 600s BC. Abraham got the promise in about 1900s BC. So you're talking about over a millennium. This is an old promise. And Jeremiah says that promise was confirmed as it is to this day. The land still belonged to Israel to this day. It's already been fulfilled. All right, now moving from the physical fulfillment of Abraham's land promise, now let's go to the spiritual fulfillment of that promise. We turn to Hebrews 4:6. Which says, therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, referring to spiritual rest, if you'll read the context in Hebrews 4, it remains for some to enter into that spiritual rest in Jesus, not bogged down by the legalism of the Jews, the author is saying, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter the rest. I'm not sure whether it's unsaved people who failed to enter the rest once it was preached to them, or whether it was Jews who believed but then didn't leave the legalism of Judaism. But at any rate, they failed to enter into spiritual rest. It's not talking about entering into the land of Canaan. It's talking about entering into spiritual rest. They didn't enter into that spiritual rest because of disobedience. God, again, fixes a certain day today. For if Joshua had given them spiritual rest, he's referring to, if Joshua had given them rest, and he's referring to spiritual rest, God would not have spoken through David of another day after that. Now, Joshua gave them physical rest by taking the promised land. And where I'm going here is I'm going to try to show you that this rest is the fulfillment of the land promise. Now, the rest doesn't say anything about land here in Hebrews 4. It's just talking about some people didn't fail to enter it. In verse 11, he says, strive to enter that spiritual rest. He's obviously referring to a spiritual condition of being close with God, resting with Jesus in the church, what he's talking about. But it doesn't tie it to the land here. But if we go back to Joshua 22:4, we see that Joshua gave the Old Testament Jews physical rest physical rest by taking the promised land. Joshua 22:4 says this, "And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers as he promised them." There's the promised land that he had promised, and when Joshua took over the land, he was given rest. Therefore, the taking of the land was called rest. They didn't have to rest. They didn't have to worry anymore about being slaves in Egypt, but now they could rest. Therefore, turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies. So there you have the promised land Joshua refers to, and he's referring to rest. So there you have land referring to rest. In Joshua 22, we go back to Hebrews 4. The author says Joshua had not given them rest, but he did give them rest in Joshua 22:4. Well, then obviously the author of Hebrews is talking about spiritual rest he didn't give them, because he did give them physical rest. So if Joshua had given them spiritual rest, he would not have spoken through David of another day after that. So what that means is that this spiritual rest that the author is talking about, he's referring directly back to the rest that Joshua gave the people in the land. But then he says, but the rest is different because Joshua didn't give them rest, meaning spiritual rest. He gave them only physical rest, but spiritual rest is what we're promised in the new covenant. So spiritual rest then becomes a fulfillment of that type of the rest that the Israelites had in the land. All right, so the land promise is fulfilled in the church. Now let's look at the fulfillment of the offspring promises. Physical fulfillment first. 1 Kings 4:20. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Okay, so there, remember, sand and sea, what was it? I'm sorry, sand and stars. That was the fulfillment, that was the offspring promise. Here's 1 Kings 4:20. Sand is the sea. Deuteronomy 1:10. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are this day as the stars of heaven from multitude. So in the days of Moses, which was long after Abraham's promise, the Israelites had multiplied until they were as the stars of heaven. So the offspring promise was physically fulfilled. Now continuing on with the idea of the physical fulfillment of the offspring promise, we go to Deuteronomy 10:22. Your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons in all. That was right down after the patriarchal period when Joseph went down there. When Joseph and then later on his brothers went down there. And now, which is at the time of Deuteronomy, which is, what is that, about, 400 or 500 years later. Now the Lord has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. You went down with 70, now we multiply, now we're as big as the stars of heaven. Sand and stars, physical fulfillment. Once again, I've lost control of my PowerPoints. Hebrews 11, verses 11 through 12. Even this shows that the land promise was physically fulfilled. Even Sarah received the ability to conceive. Since she considered him faithful who had promised, that was God who promised her an offspring, therefore also there was born of one man, and him as good as dead at that, that was Abraham. He was dead. Viagra and Silas couldn't help him any. But yet, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number that were born of that dead man. Many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. There's stars and sand. Stars and sand, the descendants of Israel. There were Jews everywhere, all over the place. But now let's look at how the offspring promises are spiritually fulfilled. First of all, they're fulfilled in Jesus. Galatians 3:16 says this, now the promises were made to Abraham and his offspring, literal offspring, physical offspring. It does not say and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. So the Old Testament said offspring. There's only one offspring, not offsprings. And so that's Christ. And of course, that's funny how I love how Paul quotes the Old Testament. He quotes it to serve his purpose. That's okay. He's an apostle. We probably wouldn't do it that way. This also shows that Paul considers the Old Testament so inspired and so inerrant that he will even take a plural as opposed to a singular word in the text and quote it to his purpose. He believed in the inerrancy of Scripture. But at any rate, Jesus is the first spiritual offspring of Abraham's promise. And now we will look at Christians who are also a spiritual fulfillment of this offspring promise to Abraham. Galatians 3:7 says this. Paul says this, "Know then, Galatians, that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham." We are those who believe in Jesus. We are sons of Abraham. You know the song, Abraham and many sons had father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. Yeah, because we're Gentiles and we're sons of Abraham. Because we believe, we have faith. Galatians 3:29, if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. Promise, what promise? The promise to Abraham. But the promise to Abraham, of course, was of a physical offspring, but now that physical offspring has been fulfilled, is really a type, the antitype of which is our spiritual offspring, the spiritual offspring of that promise. And Romans 4:13 says this, "For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." Well, we're not under the law. We're in the new covenant, so we believe by faith, and so therefore we are children of Abraham. So, spiritual fulfillment. This is easy theology here. And again, if the offspring promise is fulfilled in Christians, why do we need to worry about what happens in the millennium? The Christians are here in the church. We're not a gap. We're not a parenthesis. We're the sons of Abraham who get here by the righteousness of faith. Here's another verse showing that Christians are the sons of Abraham, the offspring of Abraham, spiritually fulfilling his offspring promise. Romans 4:16 says this, "That is why it depends on faith in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all." That means Gentiles too, as long as we share the faith of Abraham. Abraham believed and was counted unto him as righteousness. Dan Trotter believed, and therefore it's counted unto him as righteousness. Even though Abraham was a Jew, I'm a Gentile. Nonetheless, I am a child of Abraham. I'm his offspring. Romans 4:18, 2 verses later, Paul says this, "In hope he, Abraham, believed against hope." That's because he was old and didn't think he was going to be able to have kids. Or in the natural, it looked like he wasn't going to be able to have kids, but in hope he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he's been told, so your offspring be. How is he the father of many nations? He's not the father of one nation, the Jews. He's the father of many nations, the Gentile nations, which are all over the globe now, as Christians have spread to become over 1 billion people. Still talking about the fulfillment of the blessing promises. Let's look at another verse that shows, we were looking at the offspring promises, how they were fulfilled. Now we're going to look at the fulfillment of the blessing promises. Remember, LOB, land, offspring, and blessings. This is the third of the promise that was made to Abraham. Now, I don't have here a physical fulfillment. After I made these PowerPoints, I couldn't find how the blessing promise was fulfilled in national Israel. Then one day it hit me. I said, wait a minute. King Solomon, he was the big dog in the ancient Near East. He was more powerful than the Assyrians and more powerful than the Egyptians. He was more powerful than everybody. And, of course, his peace spread all over the land. The land was prosperous. They made a bunch of money. I mean, he had ports down there in Eilat, down there on the Red Sea. He had trade with all over the Mediterranean. I think he went all over to Spain, if I remember correctly. I think Tarshish of Spain. He did trade with Lebanon. He was a big shot. He was wealthy. He had all those alliances with all those women, which is unfortunate, I know. But nonetheless, my point is that the nation, there was peace in the Middle East and prosperity. Isn't that what every politician wants to promise his people? So yeah, they were physically blessed, just like Abraham said when he told Abraham, "In you shall all the nations be blessed." Well, the nation of Israel was blessed. Well, anyway, let's look at Galatians 3:8-9 to show how this blessing promise is spiritually fulfilled in the church. Galatians chapter 3, verses 8-9. "And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, In you shall all the nations be blessed." Well, what's Paul referring to? He says the gospel was preached beforehand. In other words, the promise was made to Abraham beforehand, and the end of that promise was going to be the preaching of the gospel, is what he means. So then those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham. And who are those who are of faith? The church. The church fulfills the blessing of Abraham. We are blessed along with Abraham. So there's the third blessing promise, fulfilled spiritually, physically, and spiritually. Still talking about how the promises of Abraham were fulfilled in the church. I want to look at a special consideration of Joshua 21:43 through 45. That basically is just doubling down on the fulfillment of the land promises, which I've already hit pretty hard, but I'm going to hit it even harder because this is so important in the dispensationalist scheme of things. All right, why this passage is so important? If it shows that the land promise is already fulfilled in Joshua's time, then the land promise has nothing to do with physical Israel. Neither physical Israel in the 21st century, nor physical Israel in the future millennium. Why? Because if it's already fulfilled, we don't need to fulfill it again. Now, I know the dispensationalists say, yeah, but double fulfillment. Well, I don't believe in double fulfillment, and they can't prove it. So, now the Reformed and New Covenant theological view, New Covenant theology view will win if we can show that the land has already been fulfilled, and the dispensationalists will lose unless they punt to that double fulfillment idea. So that's why this verse is so important. This passage is so important. Let's read it. Joshua 21:43 through 45 says this, So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. I quoted that in the previous section here. All right. Notice they possessed it and lived in it. Now, I also emphasize the word all. The Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn, and they possessed it and lived in it, to show that this is to show that the promise to Abraham has been fulfilled, and the Lord gave them rest. That means they didn't have to fight anymore. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Now, let me ask this question. How much more evidence is necessary to show that the promise has been fulfilled? Here's what we have. We have God gave Israel all the promise of the sworn land. All that he had sworn. I meant to highlight sworn there. All that he had sworn. All the promised land was given. Israel possessed it. Israel lived in it. The Lord gave them rest in the land while they lived in it. The Lord gave all of Israel's enemies into their hand. God made every one of his good promises come to pass. It's a slam dunk, folks. It's already fulfilled. All right, now we will go to the last part of the fifth part of my PowerPoints, trying to show that the church is spiritual Israel. We will show that the old Jerusalem has now become the new Jerusalem. Only a few slides here and I'll be finished. Galatians 4:23 through 28, Paul says to the Galatians, the Son by the free woman through the promise, this is allegorically speaking, the only allegory in the Bible, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar, and Paul has a right to do allegories. He's an apostle. We don't. So they got two covenants. We got two women. Abraham had a concubine named Hagar. He had a wife named Sarah. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Here's your analogy here. Hagar, the concubine, belongs to Mount Sinai, which is the law under Moses, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. So Paul ties the present Jerusalem, which was under the Mosaic law, to Hagar, who was not a free woman. She was a slave, a concubine. For she is in slavery with her children. Jerusalem is in slavery because they were under the law of Moses. Well, I guess covenant people might say because she was under the law of the Pharisees. But no, I believe it's because she's in the law of Moses. She was not free from the law. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. So Paul here equates the heavenly Jerusalem, the Jerusalem above, the church, as with the free woman, Sarah. So now what I'm trying to show is there's two different Jerusalems. There's an old Jerusalem, present Jerusalem, and then there's a Jerusalem above, the heavenly Jerusalem. The present Jerusalem is the Jerusalem that's under the law, the old Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem above, the heavenly Jerusalem, is the new Jerusalem, who is free because she's under the law of Christ. She is our mother. Our refers to Paul and the Galatian Christians, those who live by faith and not by the law. So the Jerusalem above, the heavenly Jerusalem, is the church. This is clear. If you read that a few times, it's very clear. The church is called the Jerusalem above. So now the old Jerusalem is no longer applicable or valid for the New Testament Christian, but we are now said to be in the New Jerusalem. So the old Jerusalem has become the New Jerusalem. Let's look at another key verse here. This is in Hebrews 12:22. The author says this to the Christians he's writing to, but you are come unto Mount Zion, you Christians, Christian Jews probably, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So what he's saying is you've come out of the present Jerusalem, because that's what the whole book of Hebrews is about, is from getting out from under the law, and you've come out from that, and you have come into the heavenly Jerusalem, that's the church, into an innumerable company of angels. The you there that I haven't read, it refers to the Christians being addressed, so it's the church that is the heavenly Jerusalem. So Paul in Galatians 4 used the term Jerusalem above, and the author of Hebrews says the heavenly Jerusalem. Well, above means in heaven. It's the same thing. So the church is the heavenly Jerusalem. Now let's look at a verse in Revelation. Revelation 21, verse 9, second part of the verse to verse 10. Jesus says to John, come hither, come here. I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. Well, that's clear. That's easy symbolism. That's the church, as we know from Ephesians 5, the bride of Christ. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Where was this holy Jerusalem? It was coming out of heaven. It was the Jerusalem above, the heavenly city. So this ties this new Jerusalem. Well, it ties Jerusalem here to this heavenly Jerusalem, Hebrews 12, in Galatians 4, the Jerusalem from above. And here we have a Jerusalem coming from above in Revelation. Now, we still haven't called it the New Jerusalem yet, but that's easy. Well, first of all, we know this is the church that's coming down because it's the bride of Christ, as I mentioned that. So we got the bride of Christ tied with the Jerusalem coming down from heaven in Revelation 21. We got the church in Hebrews 12 tied to the heavenly Jerusalem. In Galatians 4, the church is tied to the Jerusalem above. So there's a Jerusalem and a church. There's a parallel between the Jerusalem and the church. And I like these two verses because it makes it explicit. These are two scriptures that actually use the phrase the New Jerusalem. Revelation 3:12, the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. That's the New Testament temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem. So we have New Jerusalem stamped right on our heads. We have church stamped right on our heads. The new church is the New Jerusalem. So you see where the whole focus of the New Testament goes. It doesn't go to the millennium. It doesn't stay put in the Old Testament, like the Jews say, but it's all of this Old Testament stuff is typologically fulfilled in the church. And this is the essence of New Covenant theology. Let's look at one more verse in Revelation. Revelation 21:2. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. There's that coming down out of heaven again, the Jerusalem above, the heavenly Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. A bride, the bride of Christ. Slam dunk, folks. The old Jerusalem is now the New Jerusalem. You are in the New Jerusalem. How many times you ever heard your dispensationalist preachers ever talk about you being in the New Jerusalem? No, they're too busy talking about 1948 and the latest turn of Jewish politics in Israel today. But they don't talk about the fact that you, as a Christian, are in the New Jerusalem, the church, which is a big, big deal. Folks, I am finally finished with this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you stay tuned now. In the next video, we'll start taking up dispensationalism proper. I dealt with a lot of dispensationalism in this video, because it contrasted with covenant theology, even though this video was about covenant theology. But I'm going to elaborate on dispensationalism in the next series of videos so that you'll know dispensationalism more than you'll ever need to know, really. And we'll take that up in the next video.